Chapter 1. The Arrival of Cleopatra. Her name is carved in the marble of history, and yet even marble feels too cold to hold her. Cleopatra, the last true pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who could turn politics into poetry and seduction into an empire. But before the legends, before the whispers of poison and pearls, there was a young queen in exile, standing on the brink of ruin. The year was 48 BC. Alexandria, the jewel of the Nile, was torn apart by civil war. Cleopatra, barely in her 20s, had been driven from her own palace by the brother who shared her throne. The royal court, once her stage, had become a nest of knives. She wandered the desert, a queen without a crown, her survival balanced on the mercy of strangers. But even then, even in exile, Cleopatra was dangerous, not because she commanded armies, not because she wielded gold, but because she understood a truth most rulers never grasped. Power lives in the mind before it lives in the hand. And far away, across the Mediterranean, another power was moving, Rome. Its legions had crushed Gaul. Its banners now threatened Egypt itself. At the head of this relentless machine was Julius Caesar, soldier, statesman, conqueror, a man who believed he had seen it all until he met her. The meeting was impossible. Her enemies controlled the palace gates. The streets of Alexandria crawled with spies. If she approached openly, she would be captured or killed. So Cleopatra devised a plan that would become the stuff of legend. On a night heavy with salt and moonlight, a small boat slipped silently into the royal harbor. Inside, her most loyal servant carried a rolled carpet, an offering for Caesar, or so it seemed. It was carried to the palace halls, past guards who never guessed that within its folds, the Queen of Egypt was waiting. And then, before the most powerful man in the world, the carpet unfurled and she rose. Draped in nothing but linen and the scent of desert jasmine, her eyes locked on his. This was no plea for mercy. This was a declaration of war, the kind fought not with swords, but with breath and heartbeat. Caesar, who had faced 1,000 armies, stood still as if time itself had bowed to her. And in that moment, Cleopatra reclaimed her crown not by force, but by making the conqueror believe that he had chosen her. What happened next would change the fate of empires, and it would bind Rome and Egypt together in a dangerous dance from which neither could escape. Chapter 2. Caesar and the Nile Seduction. The palace had seen lovers before, but never like this. For Cleopatra, Julius Caesar was more than a man. He was a bridge to survival, a living key to Egypt's throne. For Caesar, Cleopatra was an intoxicating puzzle, a ruler in exile, a woman of impossible confidence, unafraid to meet his gaze as an equal. That night, their words were not idle. Each sentence was a move on the board, each smile a veiled maneuver. Cleopatra spoke of Egypt not as a prize, but as a partner. She reminded him that the Nile fed Rome's grain supply, that Egypt's wealth could fund his wars, if the right ruler held the crown. But beneath the currents of politics, another tide was rising. In her voice, there was music. In her pauses, there was fire. Caesar had negotiated with kings, debated in the Senate, commanded the loyalty of thousands, but here, in her presence, he found himself listening, not commanding. And she knew, oh, she knew, days turned into nights. Nights into whispers behind the heavy curtains of the royal chambers. Together they rode the Nile, its waters dark and endless beneath the moon, as Cleopatra unfurled the tapestry of her kingdom. Temples carved in gold, markets breathing with spices, priests who spoke in riddles. She was Egypt itself, ancient, sacred, and endlessly alluring. Yet the city beyond those jewel halls was restless. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was not content to share the throne. His advisors stirred the streets against her, painting her as Rome's puppet. Caesar's presence in Alexandria was a provocation, and soon the palace would be surrounded. War crept closer with each dawn, and still, Cleopatra did not rush. She understood the nature of desire. You never take the first sip too quickly. She fed Caesar pieces of herself, each more intoxicating than the last. A glance across a hall, a story half told, a promise wrapped in silence. But seduction is not safety. The day came when the streets erupted, stone and fire raining against the palace walls. The siege of Alexandria had begun. Caesar's forces were trapped in the city. The harbor was in flames, and between Cleopatra's brother's army and the Roman garrison, the palace had become a gilded cage. And yet, in the heart of that chaos, their bond only grew tighter. Danger sharpened their connection like a blade on steel. For Cleopatra knew if she could survive the siege, she would not just be queen of Egypt. She would be the woman who had bound Rome's most powerful man to her side. But in war, even the most seductive plans bleed, and the Nile was about to run red. Chapter 3: Antony and the Queen of Kings. The war for Alexandria ended in fire and victory. Ptolemy XIII was gone. Drowned in the Nile, he had once claimed to rule. And Cleopatra, restored to her throne, now carried more than a crown. She carried Caesar's child. For a moment, the world seemed hers. The grain ships sailed to Rome. The Nile flowed in peace. And in the marble heart of the Forum, Cleopatra's name was spoken in whispers, half in awe, half in fear. But fate does not allow queens to rest. In 44 BC, the Ides of March carved the future in blood. Julius Caesar was struck down in the Senate by men he had once called brothers, and with him died the shield that had guarded Cleopatra from Rome's ambitions. The streets of Alexandria grew heavy with uncertainty. Rome fractured into factions. One name rose from that chaos like a war drum: Marcus Antonius. Mark Antony. If Caesar was a blade of strategy, Antony was a storm of passion, a soldier's soldier, a man who could drink all night, fight all day, and still ride into battle with the same fire in his veins. He was not Caesar's shadow. He was a son in his own right. Cleopatra understood instantly. If she was to survive Rome's hunger, she would need Antony not as an ally, but as a lover. And so she summoned him, not to her court, but to her river. It is said that when Antony sailed into Tarsus to meet her, he expected a political negotiation. Instead, he found a vision, a barge of gold and cedar, its sails perfumed with incense, its oars dipping into the water in perfect rhythm. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, her servants fanning her with peacock feathers. Antony, who had stared down enemy spears without blinking, found his words stolen from him. She greeted him not with urgency, but with abundance, feasts that drowned the night in wine and music, stories that drew him into the deep currents of Egypt's history, glances that made him forget the borders of his own ambitions. And then, when she knew the hook was set, she offered him the world, not a Roman province, but an empire beside hers. 2 thrones, 2 crowns, united in pleasure and in war. She would give him Egypt's wealth, Egypt's armies, Egypt's undying loyalty. All he needed to do was choose her over Rome. And Antony, intoxicated beyond reason, chose. But the world does not forgive men who place love above empire. In the Senate, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, watched this union with cold calculation. He saw not romance, but rebellion, not love, but a threat. And so began a rivalry that would split the ancient world in two, a war where every kiss between Antony and Cleopatra would echo like the march of legions. But in the arms of his queen, Antony did not yet hear the drums of doom. For now, he heard only her voice in the river whispering its promise. Chapter 4: The Fall of Rome's Lovers. For years, Cleopatra and Antony lived as gods in human form. In Alexandria, they threw feasts that lasted for days, rivers of wine, mountains of figs, halls draped in silk so fine it caught the candlelight like water. They hunted together in the desert. They sailed the Nile under silver moons. They minted coins bearing their faces side by side, king and queen, lovers and rulers of an empire that dared to rival Rome itself. But in Rome, Octavian watched. He knew the Senate feared Cleopatra, feared her ability to bend Roman generals to her will, and so he sharpened that fear into a weapon. In speeches and letters, he painted her not as a queen, but as a temptress, a sorceress who had bewitched Antony, turning him against his own people. He whispered that Antony had abandoned Rome for Egypt's pleasures, that he wore the silks of the East instead of the armor of a Roman soldier, that he was no longer one of them, but hers. And then came the final insult. Antony, at Cleopatra's side, declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as the rightful heir of Rome. It was treason by another name. The Senate, under Octavian's hand, stripped Antony of his powers. War was declared, and the lovers who once dined on gold now prepared for a feast of blood. Cleopatra pledged her fleets and treasure to Antony's cause. Her ships gleamed like jewels, their prows carved with the heads of rams, their decks swarming with archers. But Octavian was not coming for a fair fight. He came with propaganda, with a Roman people already convinced that Antony had betrayed them, and he came with a navy drilled to precision, waiting for one decisive strike. The two forces met at Actium, on the blue waters of the Ionian Sea. At first, the battle hung in balance. The crash of oars, the scream of iron striking wood. But then the wind shifted. Octavian's ships closed in. In that chaos, Cleopatra made a choice that would haunt history. She turned her fleet and sailed for Egypt. Antony, torn between duty and desire, abandoned the fight to follow her. His navy collapsed, his army scattered, and Octavian's victory became inevitable. The lovers returned to Alexandria, not as gods, but as hunted prey. Outside the palace, the streets grew silent. Grain ships stopped coming. Allies vanished. Octavian's legions drew closer each day. Yet in those final months, they clung to each other with a desperation fiercer than any celebration. They knew the end was coming, but they would meet it together. For Cleopatra understood one final truth. If she could not rule the world, she would rule the ending. And in the shadows of the palace, she began a plan not for victory, but for a death worthy of a queen. Chapter 5: The Death of a Queen. The summer sun scorched Alexandria, but inside the royal palace, a different heat burned. The fever of desperation. Octavian's legions had breached the outer defenses. His banners glinted on the horizon, each step of his soldiers beating like a drum of doom. Antony, the once great general, had fallen into despair. His pride lay shattered with his fleets, his honor bleeding out with every victory Octavian claimed. He drank to drown the truth, but truth has a way of surfacing, like a corpse in still water. Then came the lie that sealed his fate. Cleopatra, knowing Octavian's game, spread word that she was dead, hoping to buy time to test the loyalty of the few who remained. But when this whisper reached Antony's ears, it cut deeper than any sword. He staggered, pale and broken, into the gardens. The man who had faced armies without fear now trembled at the thought of life without her. And there, in the shadow of a fig tree, he fell upon his own sword. But Antony did not die at once. He lived long enough to be carried to her, bleeding, gasping, still reaching for the woman who had stolen his soul. They say she refused to let him go alone. She cradled him in her arms, her silk robe soaked in his blood, her voice steady even as her heart cracked like stone in frost. "Do not fear, my love," she whispered. We will meet again in this life or the next. When he breathed his last, Cleopatra's world became a palace of ghosts. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror drunk on victory, but as a viper who had finally cornered his prey. He did not kill her outright. No, he had a crueler plan. He would drag her in chains through the streets of Rome, paraded as the spoils of his triumph. Cleopatra understood this humiliation would outlive her. She would not allow it, and so she prepared for her final seduction, not of a man, but of death itself. On a hot August day, she dressed in her finest robes of gold-threaded linen, adorned herself with crown, and sat upon her throne. At her feet lay a simple basket, its contents hidden under figs. When the guards returned, they found her lifeless, her lips pale, her arm draped elegantly across the throne, and beside her the basket, now empty, save for the faint, telltale trail of the serpent scales. The asp bite had been her final kiss. Venom in place of lips, eternity in place of breath. Cleopatra had denied Octavian his spectacle. She would not be Rome's trophy. She would be Egypt's last pharaoh, and in her death, she became immortal. Chapter 6. The Legend That Never Dies. In death, Cleopatra achieved what neither Rome's armies nor her own crown could grant her in life: eternity. News of her passing swept through Alexandria like a storm, and in its wake came whispers. Was it truly the SP, or had she hidden a vial of poison within her robes? Some claimed she had mastered ancient alchemy, creating a death swift enough to leave no trace. Others swore she had bargained with the gods themselves, trading life for a place among the constellations. Octavian denied his victory parade, buried her with Antony in a tomb whose exact location remains lost to time. Two lovers who defied the world now lay side by side, beyond the reach of emperors and history's chains. Yet Cleopatra's story did not end there. Rome's poets could not resist her. Centuries of artists, playwrights, and dreamers would dress her in silks, crown her in gold, and place her in the arms of men willing to burn empires for a single night in her gaze. Why? Because Cleopatra was never just a woman. She was an idea, a force, a living reminder that desire is the sharpest weapon in the world, able to command fleets, topple generals, and haunt the dreams of men long after their bones have turned to dust. Her seduction was not born of beauty alone, though her beauty was said to outshine the moonlight on the Nile. No, her true power lay in her mind, in her voice, in her ability to make a man believe he was not being conquered, even as she wrapped the silken chains tighter. And so, more than 2,000 years later, we still speak her name, not as a relic, not as a victim, but as a queen who understood the most dangerous truth of all, that kingdoms may rise and fall, but the heart, once claimed, can never be surrendered. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the greatest seductress of all time, lives on in paintings, in stories, in the quiet fantasies of those who imagine her smile. And perhaps, somewhere in the night, she is still watching, waiting for the next soul to fall under her spell. And so, Cleopatra's reign came to an end, but her legend never did. Here, on this channel, we bring the shadows of history back into the light. The battles, the betrayals, the loves, and the legacies. If you wish to walk with the pharaohs, dine with kings, and witness the rise and fall of empires, then join us, subscribe, and let the stories of the past continue to whisper in your ear